Everything was pretty good until about 10 years ago. That's when things went off the rails. Well, they started to get shaky around 2015, 2016, and really completely fell off the rails in 2020. When it comes to police abolitionists, elected and otherwise, I'm done with them. If you don't want to make policing better, that's my litmus test. If you want to improve it, okay. But if you're just using these attacks as a greater critique on the society that you see oppression and injustice in, then fight your battle. But I'm going to still stick with trying to improve policing in society. Cops always see people on their worst days. They don't see a true representation of the community. You don't see families so much celebrating graduations and birthdays. You see people having the worst day of your life. So it absolutely does start to weigh on you. You do start to see a community as more criminal than it is because by and large, all you're dealing with are criminals and victims. Training, education, perhaps even therapy, all these things play a factor, but I don't got a good answer to your question, for cops or for anybody.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Glenn Show. This is Glenn Loury. I'm a professor at Brown University and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York City. And I post a conversation every week at my Substack, glennloury.substack, and at YouTube. Paying subscribers get to see the podcast on Monday, and non-paying subscribers get to be notified about the podcast and invited to become paying subscribers. So podcast every week. John McWhorter is my conversation partner every other week. This week, I'm very happy to be joined by my old friend, Peter Moskos, who's a professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York, who's a doctorate degree holder in sociology from Harvard and a former, he spent a year as a cop in Baltimore walking the beat and is the author of a lot of different things. Again, what do you call it? In Defense of Flogging?
Yes, In Defense of Flogging.
An interesting Cop in the Hood is that your first book, Peter?
Cop in the Hood is what I'm most known for. That's what I banked my career on. That's about policing in Baltimore. It's a little starting to get a bit dated now because it was 25 years ago.
Man, you're that old. We're that old. And the current book, the new book out from Oxford University Press, which you can pre-order, I'm told, is called Back from the Brink. And then there's a subtitle. Peter, what's the subtitle?
Inside the NYPD and New York City's extraordinary 1990s crime drop.
He's telling the story in close quarter with the police officers who helped to execute this historical transformation of law enforcement in the city of New York, and telling it from the cop's point of view. Is it fair to say you're telling it from the cop's point of view?
Yeah, it's unabashedly an oral history, though I try to avoid that term because people say it doesn't sell books. It's a documentary, basically, in book form. I do the chapter intros. But look, I did my first interview for the book more than 10 years ago. So it's been a long, long process. But at some point, I realized, why am I going to paraphrase these guys when they speak so well and so interestingly? All I'm going to do is sort of take the edge out of it. So
let them speak.
I weave together a continuous narrative from the cops who were on the job and a few other people back in, it starts in the 70s, but really the crux of the book is the early to mid 1990s.
Well, I looked at this book and it's a loving tribute to policing. And I wonder what you think about how policing has fared in the last 25 years.
Everything was pretty good until about 10 years ago. That's when things went off the rails. Well, they started to get shaky around 2015, 2016, and really completely fell off the rails in 2020. We are starting to get back on the track a little bit. Just before we met right here, right now, I did a little Googling and looked at 35 cities to see how they did with murders last year, sort of the top 35 cities. And compared to 2023, they're down like 19%. So that's a good sign, but still higher than they were in 2014 and 2015. So we've sort of spent a decade making up lost ground that we really lost unnecessarily.
You use murder rates as a gauge of the general success of law enforcement?
Yes, I do. I avoid other crime stats as much as possible because I just don't trust them. Definitions can change. Definitions are different in different jurisdictions. You get non-reporting issues. There are lots of problems. I mean, it's not to say that these are honest statistical errors, leaving aside any malicious number fudging. But I trust murders and I trust shootings, but it's really hard to get shooting data, which is sort of outrageous given the level of shooting violence that we have in this country. But murder numbers are a good proxy for crime overall. Not perfect, but I trust them. And you can look at different cities and look at changes over time.
You say that policing's star was rising until about 10 years ago, if we were to look at the 21st century. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the big picture, even going back a bit, so, crime rate and violent crime went up in the 1960s, and basically stayed high through the 70s and 80s and into the start of the 1990s. And then there was this great crime drop that was first and largest in New York City, but it did then happen everywhere else in the nation. And things, the things that critics of policing were upset about, which usually isn't crime, but even, police use of force, police shooting people, all those, every indicator we have that we can quantify was getting better slowly, incrementally, the old fashioned way through hard work. And then in the name of racial justice, people decided that policing was the problem and not part of the solution. And policing retrenched. Sometimes it was a push from outside, sometimes it was a pull from inside. But again, you can quantify this if you look, and I don't like using arrests as an indicator of success because you can arrest or stop a lot of people and not have an impact on crime. But again, as a proxy for police activity, you can just see that there was less policing, and that really came to head in 2020. And for the past 2-3 years, police have been getting back in the game again, and along, it's not the only part, but along with prosecution, the criminal justice system started working as well or as not well as it ever does. But we're seem to be getting back on track, at least in terms of violent crime.
Okay, so I'm sitting here thinking about what makes law enforcement legitimate in the minds of people. And of course, different people are going to have different minds. But what makes that seems to me to be the real issue here at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I know that you and John McWhorter talk about that a lot, and it's inexplicably linked with race. I mean, police reflect society for better and for worse. So they're never going to be removed from those issues of legitimacy. I will say this. I do think the idea of police legitimacy is a bit of a distraction. Effective police, I think, gain legitimacy.
That's Tracy Mears, isn't it? Is that somebody, the scholar at Yale Law that, you know who I'm talking about, don't you?
I don't know who you're talking about.
I beg your pardon. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought it would be familiar to you. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I believe she's a scholar who has explored this area, this question about
I'm sure it is. I'm just forgetting her name because there is a lot that comes out of law schools and Yale in particular on this subject. But I've moved away from theory a bit. That's why I'm in criminal justice and not sociology. The legitimacy, a lot of the critics of police that say police need more legitimacy. First of all, police year after year come in as the third most, I forget the way it's phrased. Do you have confidence in the institution? One of the, I don't know if it's Pew or the other one. One of the big polling things releases trust in institutions. And it's always small business, military, and police are 1, 2, 3 in most trusted institutions. So the sniping that comes from academia, which is way down on the list, and other, journalists way down on the list.
Watch out now, watch out.
I would dare say that, let people in glass houses not throw stones, but maybe the crisis of police legitimacy isn't as great as is made out to be, which isn't to say that it could not be improved. And of course, it does matter that people in society have trust in policing because without that trust, you get retrenchment, and that leads to more death and violence. But yeah, we could talk about legitimacy all day. I prefer to talk about actually, effective crime prevention and saving lives. I should, and cut me off, I don't want to ramble too long, but the whole reason I got into this racket in the first place is because when I started graduate school in 1995, I was reading all the experts in the field, and they were saying that police don't affect crime. And you still get this from the progressive left today. And we have to address crime, the only way we can do it is to fix society, all the root causes that you're familiar with, poverty, racism, and unemployment. And I'm reading this in 1995, 1996, and murders in New York City quickly cut 50%, dropped 50%. Meanwhile, the mayor of New York, Giuliani, was slashing social spending. Poverty in New York City was getting worse. It was higher in 2000 than it was in 1990. All these other indicators were going the wrong direction, and yet murders were plummeting. And I said, all the experts are wrong. Maybe this is a good field to get into. And that's why, so this, in that sense, you could say this book has been, 30 years in the working, because it is the original question I had is how are murders going down? And then more recently, when I started this project a decade ago, I said, people talk about, well, we can debate like how much of it was policing. I think a lot, but pretty much everybody agrees policing had something to do with it. And so what I wanted this book to do was say, okay, let's look at that part. CompStat, these weekly crime meetings that started with Jack Maple and Bill Bratton and Louis Anemone. That's often given a lot of credit, but I'm like, how does a weekly meeting stop people on the street from shooting each other? Like, that might be part of it, but it doesn't explain the crime drop. So that's the inside the NYPD part of this I'm hoping to get is to really explain this organizational change.
I want to back up. I want to talk about legitimacy. I know you don't want to talk about legitimacy, but I think legitimacy depends on what you think is what your theoretical thing about legitimacy is. Partly turns on your causal model of what's going on, and that's not theory. That's empiricism.
If you see police as agents of oppression,
pardon?
If you see police as agents of oppression, and particularly racial oppression in context, police are never going to have legitimacy. So what's the end game there?
The end game is to overturn the oppression.
But policing are inherently oppressive because, say people incorrectly, that they descend from slave catchers and they're a legacy of Jim Crow and slavery. And if that's the case,
I think you're being sarcastic, right? You're saying
no, that's a real argument being made.
Well, let me try to make one.
Okay.
This is not necessarily my argument, okay?
You're good at this, I know.
Well, I'm saying there's the thing that goes on the surface, and there's a deeper structure of domination, of order maintenance, and of the enforcement of inequality and hierarchy and stuff like that. And if you go to a city, you come from another planet and you go to a city, you see some people are driving around in Teslas and other people are sleeping on their bridges. You see that. And you see there's disorder. Yeah, of course, there's disorder. And there's a social response to disorder. And the people engaged in the disorderly conduct, many of them, most of them perhaps, are disadvantaged in other ways. And the people who are comfortable want to be able to sleep quietly in their homes at night and go undisturbed to their places of business. And they have people who act as their agents to allow that to happen. They're called police. Now, to object to the order that I just described, and therefore to have enmity toward the people who enforce it, is, it seems to me, a defensible position. And the way to deal with that position is to refute the claim about the order. And that's a theoretical conversation.
It's a larger one about the capitalist or the neo-capitalist or late-stage capitalist society we live in, however you want to phrase it. And I know, given your background, that you're not too sympathetic to the...
No, I said it wasn't my argument. I was just trying to tell you what their argument was.
I know. So we overthrow society. Okay. Again, what's the end game is what I mean by that. I am for, incremental improvement where we can take it, when we can get it. At some point, I think that position, which is fundamentally an attack on Western society as we know it, on our democratic capitalistic system. A lot of people believe it. Fair play, okay. I don't know if it needs to be engaged at some level because it's such a fringe position, even though it's a very loud position. And of course, intellectually, it should be engaged because, it's better to refute arguments than ignore them. But at some point, I've just when it comes to police abolitionists, elected and otherwise, I'm done with them. If you don't want to make policing better, that's my litmus test. If you want to improve it, okay. But if you're just using these attacks as a really greater critique on the society that you see oppression and injustice in, then fight your battle. But I'm going to still stick with trying to improve policing in society.
Okay.
That there's that quote from, I can't remember, what's that French novel about, the laws are equal because they it's about sleeping under bridges and stealing bread is a crime for everybody, and it's a parody of this system. Of course, yeah, police do. They are the muscle of the state. But I believe in our maybe less and less in current politics, but I believe in our state as it stands, because what's the alternative? The alternative is anarchy, or the alternative could be communism or fascism. No, we
Well,
got to
but you
work with
just
what we
said you
got.
believed in piecemeal reform. And, I could be argumentative here. Is there any reform that you would countenance? How would that reform come about? And, are the police not corruptible? Are they not susceptible to various human frailties? And might not a concern about their exercise of especially deadly force be a legitimate thing to take on board? And in any case, as a political matter, they have to justify what they're doing. And, your diffidence, I'm done with them, is not very helpful. Certainly, that speech coming from a police chief in a big city is a complete political disaster. I think you would have to acknowledge that, wouldn't you?
I wonder. I think the pendulum is swinging a little more back to defending police as a needed institution, flaws and all, human frailties and all. Some of those mistakes have to be dismissed as human frailties. If you have, hundreds of thousands of cops in the nation, yeah, a lot of them are going to do some stupid shit every day, especially because a lot of them are young men who, get adrenaline rushes and aren't in a position of authority. So the question is, how do you mitigate that? And you can do that through evidence-based practices, through reform that involves the stakeholders. Again, anyone who wants to make the organization and system better, let's hear them out. Have a seat at the table. Let's figure out what the problems, because all policing is local. It's a little tough to do it at a national level. But there are huge differences. And you've talked about this and even credited me with it on your show about differences in police use of lethal force in different cities and different jurisdictions. And we're not talking 10, 20%. We're talking multifold differences between places like New York City and they're usually medium-sized cities out west where, places like Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Fresno, Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Cops shoot a lot more people out there.
Yeah.
If we want to reduce it, that's where we should be looking at.
Okay. Let me
But
ask
that
you a
also,
question.
Glenn, that also means we can't just see everything through the lens of race, and that's the other sort of obstacle to reform.
All right. You're going to defend Western civilization to the end, and you want to deracialize the conversation. And
Slightly. I don't want to deracialize
you
it.
want
I don't want to focus
practical
exclusively
engagement
on
with the
race.
question. I'm sorry. You want practical engagement, not speechifying and finger wagging at how to make policing better.
Yeah, I also want police to be attacked when they make errors, whether they're individual or systemic, but they need to be defended when things are ugly and they're not making errors. Bad things happen. Hey, do you know what I just heard? You know that guy who did Pizzagate?
Now, who did Pizzagate?
I mean, the one who went in there with his gun and admitted his intel wasn't that good?
Tell me about it.
Well, I mean, that was back, in the days. But he was just shot and killed by police in a traffic stop in North Carolina. So
I don't know what Pizzagate is. Forgive my ignorance.
Oh, well, I don't know fully. It was some QAnon thing. Hillary Clinton was eating babies in the basement or something.
Yeah, man, that stuff goes by me, and I don't even know
some guy
what
went
they're
to
talking
a
about.
pizza place in D.C. that didn't even have a basement. And
shot and killed by a police officer?
Well, this was in 2017, I think, was Pizzagate. But it was part of the QAnon peak of craziness. And just today, here in January 2025, he was flashed a gun at cops. I don't know the details, but yeah, he was shot and killed by police in North Carolina.
It was a good shot. It was a good shoot, as the cops would say.
I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing yes, but I don't know.
All right.
Or is it a conspiracy? Or are the cops out to get the QAnon people one by one?
I don't even, like, you don't want to hear from the people who are saying police ain't shit, and I don't care what, I don't want to hear about any of these conspiracy theories because I think they're all harebrained.
They are.
But I want to ask you a question, Peter, which is, I know you follow this kind of stuff. I assume that unarmed Black kids are still getting shot by cops every now and then. Like, it didn't completely stop. Or even armed Black kids under conditions that are ambiguous. Why do I not hear about these cases anymore? You say it's a big country, 330 million people, a lot of cops, a lot of people interacting. Surely these things are happening. And I used to hear about them from Benjamin Crump and company. Now I don't hear about them anymore. Why?
I think public fatigue. It's not getting traction. They were always selective. The numbers are not that high. And perhaps people have just started caring about other things and other deaths, whether it's in America or in Palestine or Ukraine. I don't know. It's a good question, but it's not. There'll be another though. You just wait. There'll be one soon enough. It does seem to no longer be the main focus of news right now. We got the fires in California.
Does that suggest to you that maybe some of those earlier cases that did become causes célèbres were blown out of proportion?
Just lobbing me a softball question like this is a batting cage. What do you think I'm going to say, Glenn?
I think you're going to say, hell yeah, I already told you.
Some of them were, but not all. But yeah, some of them were. We have police because they can use force. This goes back to Egon Bittner, an old professor from the 60s and 70s, who defined police by the situational exigencies of using force. Basically, if you don't need force or the threat of it, you don't need cops. And we have security guards for that. It's not that the job constantly involves force, but it is one way to define policing. It's the difference between a request and a law. You don't have a choice at some point. And if we want people to not have a choice to do certain things, well, and it's why we have laws, you need enforcement. And hopefully it's professional. Hopefully, that enforcement follows the laws and the Constitution as well. And of course, police record isn't perfect in that, but thank God we have police as an institution. They are to some extent, the bedrock of our democracy, or at least civil society, flaws and all.
Tell me what happened in the 1990s in New York City in broad strokes, and describe exactly what the magnitude of the revolution that was wrought in crime and law enforcement in New York in the 90s.
So, the big change, to some extent, it's as boring as a mission statement, but it's not boring. Trust me on that. So one of the things is there was a guy by the name of Jack Maple. He was quite a character. Bill Bratton, who became police commissioner, brought him from the transit police department where they had met. And Jack Maple was Bill Bratton's right-hand man. And when he came in, this is 1994, and he asked the police department, how many people were shot last year? Which seems like a rather basic question, and nobody knew the answer. It's hard to imagine that. But that was the state of policing in America. They knew how many people were murdered, 1,946. Turned out there were nearly 6,000 people shot in 1993 because he went and counted it. And even today, NYPD shooting data only goes back to 1993. We don't know how many people were shot in the worst year. In 1990, it was probably close to 7,000 people shot in New York City. But we don't know because they weren't keeping track. Like it's that's the part that's mind-blowing, is how little they care about crime prevention as an organization. And they set about trying to change that. And, the first part was accurate number keeping. And then they said, what can we do to actually prevent crime? Before, it was just about making, if you got 10 robberies and you make 3 arrests, that 30% clearance rate was considered okay. You do that, you avoid scandal, you avoid race riots, no big corruption problems, life is good. And crime goes up some year and down other years was the idea. You also had the receding of crack cocaine. That certainly, in 1990, that was why violence in urban America was so high. So that, you expect some sort of regression. I don't like the concept of a regression to a mean in crime data because it can always get worse. And we also found out it can always get better. There's no natural rate of crime. But so, New York went from 2,000 murders a year to, at its best, 200. That wasn't because of legalized abortion. It wasn't because we solved poverty. It wasn't because of lead paint. It was because a lot of hard work, different organizations, not just police, but you've got the entire criminal justice system got on board. You also had business improvement districts in the city, and this kind of preceded the crime drop. But Bryant Park and Grand Central Station and Times Square and Port Authority all sort of decided to improve things in the early 90s and showed that you could actually sort of reclaim public space. And that was, along with a concrete victory for those specific places through business improvement districts, it showed that urban life was kind of worth saving. And that was a big part of it too. This is not just a downhill death spiral, and everyone ends up moving to the suburbs. So it gave the city some hope that things could be accomplished. And then Bratton came in and got the NYPD focused on this stuff again. I mean, and it's just the number of lives saved is amazing. And also, let's not forget the opposition of this kind of policing from day one, because it was fundamentally more aggressive. It was cops actually out there doing things, focusing on repeat offenders, getting people wanted on warrants. A few years before that, back in the transit system, there was a crackdown on turnstile jumping and rule enforcement and getting homeless people out of the system and into shelters. So you had social services involved in this as well. And we kind of forgot the lessons, which is why I hope people read Back from the Brink so they can remember that what these lessons were and, take the good parts of it.
Okay. I hear you saying paying attention to the data. I hear you saying enhance the focus on crime prevention. I hear you saying reclaim public spaces. And it's a hodgepodge. It's not one thing.
It's problem solving. So you have to figure out what the problems are. But some of it was such low hanging fruit. Like, why don't we look where the crimes happen and then focus our police attention there? Of course, that does lead, when it comes to violent crime, to racial disparities. Some of it was saying, why are our detectives not working at night or on weekends? How come they all have 9 to 5 schedules? And they gave some bullshit answer about, well, that's when courts are open and blah, blah, blah. But they wanted it because it was a better life for them. And so they just changed that. No, you have to work. You're going to be working from, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. now because that's when the crime is happening. So a lot of these, again, the level of apathy and dysfunction before this era is really shocking, and the acceptance of it. I mean, look, any huge bureaucratic organization like this with civil service protection, you're always going to, it's a slow moving ship. And, you can't just usually you can't just crack a whip and have everybody jump into place and start working hard and smart. But you can certainly start incentivizing it and start holding people accountable. I mean, that's ultimately the CompStat meetings are just a system of accountability. You're the precinct commander, Captain Loury. What are you doing to reduce robberies and shootings? And you better have answers. And if those don't work, then we go to plan B. But you can't just say, some years crime goes up and some year crime goes down.
How do you think the racial disparity problem should be dealt with? You say more proactive policing, more engagement, and there's going to, you go where the crime is, so it's a geographic location of resources, but you also intensify, you've chased down warrants and whatnot. And in any of this, you're going to get a racial disparity, and that's going to be a political problem. How do you think it should be dealt with?
I think you got to deal with the community at one level and with the politics at a tangential but different level. Also, polling data shows that Black communities want more policing more than white communities do. More and better. It's not that complicated of a position. But if you don't feel safe leaving your house, almost every other concern pales in comparison, sort of somewhere on the hierarchy of needs. Basic feeling of public safety is very high up on that list. So from a police so first of all, I'm saying police are, by and large, welcomed in these communities. Now, police can mess up that trust. So you have to be open about your strategies. This is what we're doing it. You're never going to have a 100% success ratio and only targeting the people you're trying to target. You have to explain it and say, look, this is why, and then it has to work. And so it can't just be from the organization standpoint. It can't just be stat-based. Sure, you've got a problem of, say, street prostitution. Okay, well, we made this many arrests. Well, did that solve the problem? And if the answer is no, then the arrests are not just pointless, but probably counterproductive, whether you're arresting the sex workers or the Johns. It has to be focused on a very, a stated goal for whatever problem it is, be it public prostitution, be it shooting violence, be it turnstile jumping, be it public injection. You have to define the problem correctly, and in a way, make sure that it's narrow enough that you can actually achieve it. I mean, you go after repeat violent offenders as part of it. Then you need cooperation with prosecutors, because if you catch somebody who has a bunch of bodies to his name, you might have caught him for something small, but you say, this is that major player. We have to take him seriously, so we do want to throw the book at him, even if it's even if the crime is just nonviolent gun possession by a felon or something. And then, and politically, you have to explain it the same way, but you have to make sure that, a lot of the louder activist class does not represent the community. So that's what I mean. If you go into the churches, you're going to get a very different response than if you talk to protesters outside City Hall. So you have to address both of them. But it's about transparency, it's about accountability, and it's about listening to the problems that people are actually having on their block and in their neighborhood.
The homicide numbers are really amazing to me in terms of this transformation from nearly 2,000 a year to under
300. Well, yeah,
under 300.
But yeah, 292 in 2017.
What's going on there? Is there something specific to homicide? What are the clearance rates like? What about witness cooperation and witness intimidation and stuff like that? What about don't snitch and that kind of mentality? What about gangs? What about weapons? How are they implicated, if at all, in the remarkable transformation of homicide numbers? And as you point out, in the still existing geographic variation across regions of the United States and the intensity of homicide.
I focus on a few cities. I mean, Chicago because I was born there, and New York because I live here, Baltimore because I work there. I don't know what's going on in a lot of these cities, honestly. But whenever I do look in one, there often is a strategy. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Now in New York City, because I've been researching it for so long and so in depth, some of it did involve locking up repeat violent offenders. Incarceration did play a role. Now that, in turn, takes some potentially bad role models off the street. That might have a knockdown effect. Some of it was enforcing gun laws. The streets were de-escalated. Especially now, there's a lot of talk, and you see it from progressive prosecutors. You see it from public defenders who don't want gun laws enforced, again, because of racial disparities. But I don't know, you can't address murder in American cities. We can't ignore those racial disparities.
Victimization or of perpetration?
Both. I mean, it's more polite to talk. I mean, to talk about victimization, partly because we know better. We don't know for sure the race of all the offenders, but it's intra-racial, most crime. So there are some innocent victims of robbery or carjackings, but by and large, the victim, the Venn diagram between victim and offender is heavily overlapped when it comes to shootings and murders, and it is almost exclusively in cities non-white, which I also, and it's Black or Hispanic. It's also non-Asian. I mean, the disparity, the shooting victims in New York City are 95% Black or Hispanic, and I bet my life is the same in Chicago. I mean, that's 95%. Not 100%, but we're getting pretty close there. So any focus on shootings and violence is going to reflect that racial disparity, which is, why you have to be careful too.
How do cops avoid falling into a stereotyping thing, given the stark racial coloration of one of the major offending things that they have to be concerned about stopping and not being victimized by? How do they not become racist, quote unquote? I don't mean disparagement. I just literally mean using race as a part indicator of danger and conditioning their behavior accordingly.
How does anybody, Glenn? I mean, seriously, I think the same way and with the same level of effectiveness or ineffectiveness of doing so. I will say from my experience policing in East Baltimore, America is so segregated that the odds are you are working in a community that is not integrated. Even the most closed-minded bigot I would find it hard not to make some distinction between the hundreds and thousands of people you run across in any one community. If you work in an all-Black community, you're going to see the incredible diversity in that community, whether you want to or not. If everyone is Black, I think you will start to not just see race, because there are almost no white people in a lot of these neighborhoods, except for some cops and teachers and, government employees. So that's part of it. But it's not easy. I don't know. Of course, yeah. Cops always see people on their worst days. They don't see a true representation of the community. You don't see families so much celebrating, graduations and birthdays. You see people having the worst day of your life. So it absolutely does start to weigh on you. And yeah, I think you do start to see a community as more criminal than it is, because by and large, all you're dealing with are criminals and victims. Training, education, perhaps even therapy, all these things play a factor, but I don't got a good answer to your question, for cops or for anybody.
Is there a suicide problem among cops?
There's a suicide problem in America. So you hear a lot that cops commit suicide at disproportionate rates. Cops are not, you're dealing with a lot of young men who have higher rates of suicide in general. I'm not saying, I don't know, but I haven't seen the data that shows that compared to that demographic, a somewhat self-selective and stratified sample, I've never seen any data showing the suicide rate is that much higher for this group, but it might be. It's I would say there is a level of emotional trauma that is much higher. I look at the people who I worked with 20 years ago, and it's not that they're functional, but no, I got a lot of friends who are a little bit messed up from policing. It is a rough job emotionally.
What about the overlap between military service and engagement in law enforcement as a career? Is there a kind of ladder of progression there? A person gets familiar with weapons and stuff like that, and they come out of the service and they're looking for something to do?
Yeah, the influx of veterans happened into policing happened after the Vietnam War, or during the Vietnam War and after it, and then after our various wars post September 11, 2001. So I see it in students and cops now, but it wasn't a big factor when I was a cop. But from what I hear and believe, there are pluses and minuses to being a veteran. The minus being some of that trauma you may have suffered as a veteran is probably not good to bring over into policing. Rules of engagement are cops aren't soldiers. And it doesn't mean that people can't transition from one to the other, but there are different rules of engagement. There's a different concept of enemy. Soldiers have instructions. They're not out there alone making decisions. Police have a paramilitary model based on the military, but as a patrol cop, you get a call and you're there alone. Your sergeant isn't with you. You have to make these decisions. So that's very unlike the military. That said, veterans tend to show up to work on time and know how to shine their shoes and have a sense of duty and obligation. It can sound a bit hokey to say they've taken an oath, but I think only people who have never taken an oath would say that. I was proud to raise my hand and swear to defend the Constitution of the United States and Maryland back in those days. You can lose that feeling, that idealism, but it's always good to have a little bit with you and to remember that ultimately you're on the side of good. So it's a mixed bag with veterans. But right now there's such a shortage in hiring,
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I heard there are real recruiting problems in a lot of departments around the country.
And not all departments, but yeah, in a lot of departments. In the departments that saw the biggest, anti-policing protests a few years ago, in the Seattles and Portlands. So the cops have been making lateral transfers, as it's called. Why go from a city where you get yelled at every day by the public? Why not move to that suburb over where the mayor actually supports you and the public welcomes you, and there's less crime and the working conditions are better? And the shame, of course, is these departments that cops are moving to are often taking the cream of the crop because, if you have a bunch of open investigations and sort of a bad track record, they're not going to take you.
So this thing that Heather McDonald first started talking about, so-called Ferguson Effect of withdrawal of police intensity of law enforcement in the face of the questioning of their activities because of some incident, some shooting or something, and then the feds get in and the press gets in and the demonstrators come and there's riots and whatnot, and the police end up on the short end of it. And Roland Fryer has had a more systematic statistical investigation of the same kind of thing, what he calls viral incidents, if it's a city with a viral incident, and a federal pattern and practice investigation from the Justice Department, that those two things taken together create a regime change kind of thing in the policing attitudinal space. And, as you say, less arrest and less engagement and whatnot is a measure of the withdrawal. They're pulling back. Why stick my neck out if you're not going to have my back? Something happens. You buy all of that?
Most of it. They have made, especially Roland Fryer, has made more nuance. I mean, you're summarizing it. That's fair. But cops are still going to respond to the calls for service. There's certain parts that they don't have control over. In that sense, they're going to do their job. But let's say you're driving down the street on the south side of Chicago, and there's someone, loitering in an alley or looking into backyards. Do you stop that person? You have legal justification based on reasonable suspicion. You can articulate why that's suspicious, but you don't have to. It's work. And now you say, yeah, that's your job. Or is it? And cops, they weigh this. Well, first of all, am I about to get off work? You're much less likely if your shift is ending. That's human nature, because you might suddenly, you might have. What happens if you stop the person and he's wanted on a warrant and he puts up a fight and you're in an alley? You're rolling the dice. And then let's say you do shoot this person, justified or unjustified. But there you go. Suddenly, you're that person or you can just pretend you didn't see that person and drive away. That was the calculus being made, just a simple cost benefit of this interaction. That guy may have a very good chance to be in that alley. A very good explanation, I should say, to be in that alley. You don't know till you stop him. But so it's that discretionary stuff, the low-level stuff, someone with an open container. Are you using that as an opportunity to interact with someone? See what he's up to. Maybe there's more, maybe there's not. But you need that legal justification. So cops were disinclined to do that for fear of being in the news, basically. And then let's not also forget that many laws in certain cities were passed to prevent cops from doing this, whether it's limiting why cops can pull over cars. Chicago, in effect, banned foot pursuits after that. There was a kid, I say this like you would remember, I don't know. Adam Toledo was his name, and he and his friend were firing off a gun. Spot shot her, detected it, cops responded. He had the gun, was in the process of dropping it. The cop shot one shot and killed him. The powers that be decided that whole thing could have been avoided if cops weren't allowed to chase the guy, the kid. Okay, I mean, that's a choice. It's a political choice. What was the kid doing out there at, I think it was, 2 or 3 a.m.?
Yeah,
Why was he firing a gun? Like, those seem to be more important questions that should be answered. But yeah, if the less policing there is, the fewer people, given a constant level of violence, which doesn't stay constant, but the less policing we have, the fewer interactions we'll have and the fewer uses of force we'll have.
I was thinking about these pretextual, you have a pretext, stops, where you really want to see what he's up to, in your words. You really want to look and see what's going on. It's kind of suspicious, but, and so you have legal warrant, because of probable cause or something.
Reasonable suspicion.
Was it?
Reasonable suspicion for
reasonable suspicion. But you're exercising discretion, and it's messy. They're going to be type 1 and type 2 error kind of things going on. And
now, the discretion is not always pretextual. There's a slight, there is this idea where I'm just trying to find somebody with drugs on them, so I'm stopping cars or people. That's the pretextual stop you might find. If the guy's in an alley being suspicious, you're stopping him because he's suspicious. So that's a slightly different. That's discretionary. But it's not a pretextual stop. But you might make a pretextual stop on somebody by name and date of birth and previous 3 arrests. You might want to see what he is up to, but that should be about him based on the information. That's different than just stopping anybody for any cause that you can barely justify legally. But that stop on that violent offender might be pretextual. Yeah, I want to pull him over, but it's because of him. There was something like 360 jaywalking tickets given in New York City in, I think, 2023, one of the previous years.
That
City of 8
sounds like a
million.
vast underrepresentation of the number of people who were actually observed by police officers to be jaywalking,
Now
which
you
has
wonder.
the number in the many hundreds of thousands.
Now you understand why you can't trust crime stats, Glenn. But here's the thing: is I would guess that almost every one of those 360 people was a convicted felon, because that was one of the justifications cops were using to stop certain individuals. They needed a legal reason. They could find another, and there probably are now. But so because of that, one of my local state reps passed a bill to decriminalize jaywalking because of the racial disparity in those 360 stops. Yeah, 360 in a city of 8 million. Like, you just didn't understand. None of them were stopped because they were jaywalking as a moral offense. It was just, that was a pretext. But I would say it was probably a good pretext given how rarely it was used. But the result is, you just so that, anyway, they took away that tool from cops. Now they're going to have to find something else to stop those people. But the real question is, do we want those people stopped, those 360?
Yeah, it sounds like your answer is yes. I think that's my answer too. Especially if you want the murder rate to go down from 2,000 to under 300.
It's one of the tools. Now, going back, we were talking about this before. So there was a certain amount of low-hanging fruit. There was a certain amount of federal locking up gangs, taking down big gangs. I mean, there were some large organizations at the time, New Jack City style, if you remember that movie. So those were broken up. But there was a virtuous cycle where people, first of all, there was, this idea, well, I'm just carrying a weapon for protection. I'm not saying you don't have a threat, like you might be justified, but you still can't. Those are our rules. And I'm sorry if that puts you in a worse position, but you can't carry an illegal gun just for protection. But as violence went down, there was less of a need for people to feel that. And then, I think people stopped carrying knives. So there was a greater de-escalation of the street that prevented a lot of this violence from happening. And, even just having access to a gun is different than having it on you, because a lot of these murders are impulsive and come from arguments. And simply having to go upstairs and get it, things might cool down, or the person may leave, or whatever. Your girlfriend convinces you not to go back outside, or whatever the cause may be. But so you had a lot of these different things, really in sync. And it became easier once violence went down. If you think that any city has X number of homicide detectives, well, if their caseload is now half of what it was, they're going to be able to do a little bit better job. And so you probably, I think there's data on this. I don't know, but I think you had greater clearance as the homicides went down. So all this came into play. As neighborhoods got better, of course, there was more opportunity, whether it's through jobs or, some call that. It's interesting because a lot of New York didn't gentrify. A good chunk of it did. But the neighborhoods that were most violent in 1990, by and large, did not gentrify. They just became safer. And, the other thing is you get less trauma from victims and victim family that spreads so tenaciously, both laterally out, but also, intergenerationally. If you can cut this off and you prevent retaliatory violence. So you just start the sort of virtuous circle, but it's all dependent on some basic level of public safety.
Have you had occasion to talk with any of your interviewees about your book? Did you share, with them? These are the cops who you allowed to speak in their own voice at length in some sections of the book. And I can just only imagine how gratifying to them it must have been to find an opportunity to express themselves and to find a scholar like yourself who was going to take an interest in what they had to say.
By and large, well, it helps, first of all, that most of these cops were retired. On-duty cops are always a little bit paranoid about talking, but I did interview a bunch of on-duty cops as well. But you had to have been on the job in 1994, so that limited it. That was a later qualification once I realized what and when the story was. There was a great sense of pride. They were so happy to talk to me. And, there were a couple interviews that didn't happen, presumably because they didn't want to talk to me. Nobody actually ever said no. Once I was able to ask people, they were thrilled and would give me their friends' names. At some point I, reached in the qualitative world what's called saturation. And and the book at, it's 100,000, 120,000 words, couldn't get any longer. So I realized at this point, everybody I add, I have to take something else out. So it became what it is in its current form. But yeah, there was a lot of real pride about that I think was underappreciated. They would have gotten paid the same if this didn't happen. So they had to sort of internalize it, that sense that we actually had a chance to do good and did it. I will say I had a tough time getting Ray Kelly as an interviewer, as an interviewee, but I did.
Congratulations.
And early on, I had an interview scheduled with the guy I met at some radio station interview, a young Brooklyn borough president by the name of Eric Adams. And I dropped the ball on that. He rescheduled a few times, and I said, who needs him?
Yeah. How did you know what was going to happen? Of course, he's going to jail, isn't he?
He's indicted. Yeah. I don't know. We'll see.
Let us not prejudge. He's innocent until proven guilty. I want to ask you a question, though. Derek Chauvin.
Yeah.
This is the Minneapolis cop that got convicted and sentenced to over 20 years and is serving in a federal prison in Arizona, if I'm not mistaken, and who was victimized by a stabbing incident after being incarcerated, and is the face of he's the killer of George Floyd, the famous George Floyd. And I just wonder what cops, if you give them a few drinks and they don't think anybody's got a microphone going, really think about that. I can imagine, and I don't want to answer for you, I just want to kind of flesh this out. 2, possibly he was a bad cop. Too bad what happened to him, but he was a bad cop. But the other thing I could imagine is he's a victim of a political mob. It was a lynching, kind of. I mean,
and
forgive me, I know people will be offended by me using that word, but if you're a cop and you identify with Chauvin and you saw what happened to him and the circumstance under which he was railroaded, he was, whatever. Oh, what do you think?
Those aren't mutually exclusive, those two positions, first of all. I think there's a bit of a split. Let me just mention one other cop who I think cops are rightfully much more supportive of. Darren Wilson, I believe was his name.
That was Michael Brown.
Yeah, because it turned out that the whole hands up, don't shoot thing was a lie. And, Darren Wilson went into hiding and is no longer a cop, though I've heard through the grapevine that he's perfectly happy with his life, so be it. But that sort of scared cops, again, because he didn't mess up. And they went after him. Chauvin, I think a lot of cops don't sympathize with what he did. I think a lot of other cops and some of the same cops will also say that, sometimes people just die when they're being arrested. I don't think there's universal assumption that he actually killed him, if that makes sense, even though he did kill him and legally he murdered him. He died because of the police action. There's a lot more sympathy for the 2 cops who were standing by.
Yeah.
And then the smarter cops will say, flaws and all, it was systemic. Why the hell was Chauvin a field training officer, given his record? Minneapolis police was supposed to be, had so many programs, the full treatment of the progressive thinking of the day on how to make policing better and so on. And whatever they did, it wasn't good enough, because at some point, a cop murdered a man. Yeah, what are the systemic issues there? Why did it happen? Why are they in that city of all places rather than some other city? But then at your average cop, because your average cop is a Trump voting conservative, will then talk about the civil unrest and pivot over to those other 2020 issues.
All right. You want to add anything, Peter, before we close?
Glenn, I'm good. I'll just say, Back from the Brink again, the name of my book.
Back from the Brink. What's the subtitle
I should mention,
again?
you may know one of the blurbs is from someone you may be familiar with, a professor at Columbia by the name of John McWhorter.
Yeah, we heard of him around here at the Glenn Show. I know that guy.
You should have him on sometime.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Back from the Brink. And what's the subtitle?
Inside the NYPD in New York City's extraordinary 1990s crime drop. It'll be out in March, but it is available on Amazon right now.
For pre-order, a kind of oral history of this remarkable period in the history of American policing, told in the voices of the officers themselves, and told in a very sympathetic and well-informed voice, and that is the voice of our guest, Peter Moskos, professor of criminology at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So thanks a lot, Peter.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
We'll do it again.